Everybody has to sign this.
We're asking if we can bring in more chairs. We can't, right?
Well, we can't bring in more chairs. People are welcome to pull up chairs in this area, though. That's been done before.
You.
Chairs that I can pull.
Oh, they're around the corner. You'll see. There are a bunch of these chairs.
You will go first.
Right.
For 15 minutes, more or less. 10, 15 minutes. Just talk about whatever you want. Talk about what's in the book. Talk about
I got a summary of the book.
Right, okay.
But you said after everyone's done.
After everyone's done, you can respond.
Yeah.
And then we'll have questions from the audience. This is always a very vocal crowd, so
I can see.
yeah.
You can see.
Fred needs to borrow a book. I'm suggesting, I'm volunteering Ira's position. Well, while he's speaking, he may want to refer to his
actually
number.
own 2 copies.
What is today?
Well, I have it on Kindle.
Second.
Thank you so much. So, Eric?
What? Did I tell what?
In
What?
3 or 4 minutes. Well, we will start on time.
Yes.
All right, so it seems, yes.
I want to tell Fred a story.
I mean, no.
I met Senator McGovern.
You know, look,
Oh, yeah, you fill it out. And I'm
This is
still
not lately, since he was
John, with us. It was 3 months before he came.
I'm not what's I mean,
We're at a conference at
no.
Good, thank you.
and I said, so pleased to meet you. I'm honored to have worked here in 1972. And he said to me, when did I have to very
Oh, well, it's not this week, right?
That's good. I ran
No,
into
he's
the
not in
government
the
around 78 or 79. He was just sitting there all by himself, looking very tan. I looked, I said, Senator, you look a lot better than you probably would look if you were born. Now you look probably relaxed and happy. You know, he said, yeah, I'm sure you were.
In '72, I was his spokesman in Western Pennsylvania, and I drove him all around.
Oh my God, well, then you got to see him.
I spent time with him. Yeah, I spent. This was a disillusioning experience because I discovered that he still thought Henry Wallace was a great man.
Of course, I would imagine you would.
That's it. It's interesting, actually.
It is interesting.
Well, this is in 72.
This is '72. Yeah.
There were pieces of Henry Wallace that to this day I'm prepared to say were very positive. But I'm not prepared to say he was a great man.
But McGovern was of. I mean,
Well, he was from Minnesota. No, South Dakota. Where is he?
Not
Close.
Eugene McCarthy.
No, that's who I'm thinking of.
they're
One
close.
of those guys, yeah.
But the difference is that today, well, no, it's North Dakota. North Dakota
Is rich now.
is just booming.
Their oil, they're fracking oil. Nobody can even find a place to live there.
Actually, I got a complaint. I ran into someone from North Dakota. Some talk I don't know when it was, and her complaint was that all these guys from what do you call the guys that do the oil rigs? There's a name for them. They come over, they ruin the town. They create whorehouses.
Oh, all right.
You know,
I see.
you know, they ruin the moral fabric of this North Dakota. And I said they had Rick. Oh, I can't remember the name.
What about the Indians? What they damn Indians? Black Hills? No, that's South Dakota. I wonder if the Indians are going to claim any of this oil.
The only part of America you really know well is Texas. It's all over Texas.
I'm always in Texas. I'm going down there in 2 weeks. I love you. I love Texas. What a place. I'll take a story about Texas. My daughter was fit. My daughter was in Texas in August for some reason. Asked her, she's riding around near El Paso in the United States. And she gets a message on her cell phone, international
Well, I didn't want to expect it either.
So, I don't know if Texas is part of the United States or not. She was definitely on this side of the border.
Well, look at this guy.
That is how Governor Perry balances the budget.
Right.
No taxes.
He doesn't balance it with brilliance.
Well,
I met him. He's really dim.
Seriously, even on a small.
He's really dim.
look, he's.
Yeah.
Is your daughter pregnant, Foner?
Peggy, she's my cousin.
Oh, I used to know her.
Oh, well, good. All right, I think everyone is seated here. We're going to start right on time. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the Heyman Center for arranging this. Thanks to Sarah Monk, wherever she is, for doing all the logistical work here. Thank you to the History Department for co-sponsoring this. Okay. So this panel is inspired by a book by Fred Siegel, who's sitting next to me, about liberalism. Here, what's the exact title? The Revolt Against the Masses. Those of you who took CC will know that this is a reference to...
Read the subtitle.
Oh, and the subtitle, sorry. I'm going to guess. How Liberalism Has Undermined the Middle Class. So this book is a critique of liberalism, and we are here to discuss it.
Finish the point about Ortega.
Oh, and the CC, Ortega and Gasset's The Revolt of the Masses, so this is a pun or a irony or something like that. Fred will explain. Everybody's has their name in front of them, so I don't even have to exactly introduce them, but let me just give a sentence about each person before we begin. Fred Siegel is the author of several books. This one, The Revolt Against the Masses. His previous book, The Prince of the City, Giuliani, New York, and the Genius of American Life. He wrote The Future Once Happened Here about New York and other big cities, and although he didn't list this, he wrote what he gave me, The Roots of Southern Distinctiveness about...
The title comes from Eric, actually.
Right, the book comes from Fred. It's about tobacco culture in pre-Civil War Danville, Virginia. He's moved from Danville to studying larger cities. And he taught at Cooper Union for a good while and now is a scholar in residence at St. Francis College and a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Judith Stein over here is a distinguished professor of history at City College and the Graduate Center of the City University. She's the author of several important books, The World of Marcus Garvey, Running Steel, Running America, and most recently, Pivotal Decade, the 1970s. And she's currently working on a book called Globalization and Neoliberalism in the United States. Ira Katznelson, sitting to my right, the Ruggles Professor of Political Science and History here at Columbia, literally needs no introduction. He's the president of the Social Science Research Council. He's the author of many important books, most recently Fear Itself, The New Deal and the Origins of Our Time, which won the Bancroft Prize in History and several other awards last year. Ann Kornhauser, a PhD from Columbia's History Department, is an assistant professor of history at City College, working on 20th century U.S. intellectual, legal, and political history, and is the author of a forthcoming book, Debating the American State, Liberal Anxieties, and the New Leviathan. And I'm Eric Foner from the Department of History. So what we will do is have Fred talk for a little while about the book. By the way, let me say at the beginning, as you may have noticed, the book is on sale, and I urge everybody to get their copy. Fred will be happy to sign it afterwards. Even though many of our comments may be critical, that's the point of this discussion, to debate, the book is very much well worth buying and reading, so I urge you all to do that. So Fred will talk for a while, and then each of us will respond in about 10 minutes each. Fred will get one more word in to respond to us, and then we'll open it up for questions for a good while, so get your thoughts in order. So without any further ado, Fred Siegel.
First of all, I want to thank Eric for setting up this forum and inviting me. This is what I'm just going to give is just a brief summary of what the book is about. I'll be happy to go into more detail later. When we think of liberalism today, that is the top and bottom coalition we associate with President Obama. That liberalism began not with progressivism, not with the New Deal, but rather in the wake of World War I's disillusionment with American society, the reaction essentially to the repression of the Woodrow Wilson years. In the 1920s, the first writers and thinkers to call themselves liberals adopted an hostility to bourgeois life that had long characterized European intellectuals of both the left and the right. The aim of liberalism's founding writers and thinkers, Herbert Croly, Randolph Bourne, H.G. Wells, Sinclair Lewis, H.L. Mencken, was to create an American aristocracy of sorts, to provide the same sense of hierarchy and order long associated with European statism. Just one quote from Mencken. Mencken supported Germany in World War I. He wanted Germany to win. He made no bones about this. And he called American democracy the worship of jackals by jackasses. Like communism, Fabianism, and fascism, modern liberalism was a vanguard movement, born of a new class of politically self-conscious intellectuals. Critical of mass democracy and middle-class capitalism, liberals despised the individual businessman's pursuit of profit, as well as the conventional individual's self-interested pursuit of success, both of which were made possible by the lineaments of the limited 19th century state. Snobbery is not new to liberalism, but the actual history of liberalism will be new to most readers. That was my reason for writing this book. This period, this founding moment in liberalism is really undiscussed anywhere. The history of liberalism, as written by liberal historians, begins either with the pre-World War I progressive movement, or more likely with the New Deal of the 1930s. And the plumb line accounts usually wholesale as a direct descent from either progressives and the New Deal, the social salvation presented by the New Deal, to the Great Society and on up, depending on your point of view, or down to the present. The progressives, it said, were the first to show that big non-constitutional government could be used to go after big problems. But after the yahoos of the 20s put the country to sleep, leading to the stock market crash, the New Deal supposedly rose to the rescue to establish the Beau ideal for future governance. Conservatives tell a similar story, but theirs is an account of the descent from from liberty into statism. The trouble is, the story isn't quite true at the beginning, middle, or end. The story of liberalism is more than a story of how the administrative state broke free of its constitutional bounds. Liberalism, like its rivals, communism, fascism, and social democracy, was a response, like all the other mass movements, to the emergence of mass society, mass culture, mass democracy. Something fundamental had changed, and liberalism responded to it. Liberalism was strongly influenced by the Nietzschean ideal of a true aristocracy. The old aristocracy was dying, wasn't worthy of support, but what was needed, it was argued, was a new aristocracy, shorn of the debasements of modern commercial society and traditional assumptions. And one way to summarize this is to say that each generation of liberals ever since had their bout with the Babbitts, referring to the Babbitt, Sinclair Lewis's Babbitt, their bout with middle class ideal of businessmen. It was the liberals' claim to be an aristocracy based on talent and sensibility that helped define the 60s and 70s. It was then that highly educated liberals acting, they said, on behalf of African Americans, pushed aside the social democratic traditions of the New Deal and the Democratic Party. And the social democratic period of American liberalism really begins in the mid-30s and ends in the mid-60s. There's 30 years of this, but there are many years since and there are the years before. Liberalism was far more permeable and far more politically adaptable than most of its competitors. But it nonetheless represented a distinct ethos, a stylized set of political emotions, at odds with Americans' democratic, capitalist, and egalitarian traditions. The set of cultural emotions, cultural attachments, the political libido of liberalism, so to speak, coalesced in the wake of World War I, an angry repudiation of progressivism and Woodrow Wilson. The very term liberalism in its modern usage was coined by writers and intellectuals who defined themselves by their hostility to the moralistic progressives who would impose prohibition. Nothing other than World War I itself aroused such liberal ire. And this liberalism begins as a response to the excesses of World War I. The crackdown on sauerkraut. You've all read this in some survey course or another. It was in the seminal 20s that the strong strain of snobbery, so pervasive among today's gentry liberals, which is a term I used through the book to describe what liberalism became in the post-McGovern years, gentry liberalism. first defined the then nascent ideology. The best short credo of liberalism came from the pen of the once canonical left-wing literary historian Vernon Parrington in the 1920s. Now, some of you are old enough, and I see a few people in this room who are old enough, know who Vernon Parrington is. He was once a canonical author. I may be wrong, but I think he's largely forgotten. He was also the football coach at Oklahoma.
Wow.
Yes. Eric knows a lot about a lot of things. Football coach.
Yes, 1910.
That stopped me.
It was the first liberal football team in America.
Football wasn't as big a deal then as it is now.
This is Parrington from the late 20s. Rid society of the dictatorship of the middle class, and the artists and the scientists will erect in America a civilization that may become what civilization was in earlier days, a thing to be respected. He was deeply alienated from American middle class life, and he hoped it would be displaced. He hoped by an organic, either organic intellectuals, as the term would come to be known, or by an organic working class later. This is not, I shouldn't say this for Parrington per se, but Parrington's supporters. In the mid-50s, during a brief reconciliation between liberals and their country, very brief, the literary critic Lionel Trilling, who's widely overquoted on this subject, noted that for the first time in the history of modern American intellectuals, America is not to be conceived of as a priori the most vulgar, the most stupid nation in the world. This novelty soon passed. The ideals of the 1920s liberals were, by way of the statist and technocratic elements of the 1930s, carried over into the 1960s. It was the 1960s that liberals, even more than conservatives, laid siege to the social democratic solidarity of the New Deal. In the name of good causes, such as opposition to racism, the war in Vietnam, post-New Deal upper middle class liberals looked to remake America in their own image by enhancing their own power. They defined middle class Americans, including those who made it into modest prosperity through unionized work, as the unenlightened objects of their enmity. And here there's a quote from Eric Hoffer. Just curious, how many people remember the name Eric Hoffer? Oh, so there's a few people. This is very good. I'm at Columbia. This is I'm not used to people knowing who he is, even at other colleges. This is Hoffer, 1968. There is nothing in contemporary America that can cure or alleviate the chronic frustration of the new class. They want power, lordship, and opportunities for imposing action. And when he talked about the new left, he talked about them as a new class. Even if we could banish poverty from the land, lift up the Negro to true equality, withdraw from Vietnam, and give half the national income as foreign aid, they, the new class, will still see America as an air-conditioned nightmare. Much of the middle and lower middle class, subject to liberal experiments in schooling, crime, and gender relations, reciprocated the animosity. Liberal social programs to combat poverty and reform the schools, their failures now long institutionalized, although not necessarily acknowledged, have produced a government whose grasp far exceeds its competence, and whose costs are carried by the private sector middle class. Like corrupt Harlem Congressman, now here I don't have to explain who Charlie Rangel is, like corrupt Harlem Congressman Charlie Rangel, he of the 3, 4, or 5 rent-controlled apartments, who did his best to keep new business out of Harlem, something I've written about, so that Charlie could fend off rivals and garner anti-poverty money for his friends and allies. Liberalism has been dedicated to preserving the problems for which it represents itself as the solution. Preserving the problems for which it represents itself as the solution. Here's another quote from Eric Hoffer. Every great cause begins as a movement, becomes a business, and eventually degenerates into a racket. Charlie exemplifies that. In today's America, those who claim to be morally superior all too often enjoy both neo-Gilded Age wealth and close ties to government. After the government-driven failures and excesses of the past 40 years, liberalism has become an ugly blend of sanctimony, self-interest, and social connections. When the editor-in-chief of the popular liberal website, Slate, I can say his name is here, so I use his name elsewhere, people have no idea. I'm talking about Jake Weisberg, who's a good guy in many ways. When the editor-in-chief of Slate, frustrated with opposition to Obamacare, entitled an article, "Down with the People," he echoed the assumption that has driven liberalism since its inception. Liberalism is a search for status is sufficiently adaptable that even in failure, self-satisfaction trumps self-examination. As the liberal critic Edmund Wilson, not always liberal, sometimes radical, sometimes just nutty, a critic Edmund Wilson noted without irony, the liberal has evolved a psychological mechanism which enables him to turn moral judgments against himself into moral judgments against society. And then I'm almost done. This is a book about the inner life of American liberalism. It's not a book about the administrative state, about which Anne has just written. It's not a book about the New Deal heritage, which Ira has written. It's not a book about New Deal economic policy, which Judy has written. It's about the liberals' love affair with their own ambitions and their own emotional impulses. Liberals believe they deserve more power because they act on behalf of people's best interests, even if the darn fools don't know it. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Fred.
Okay, Judith Stein is first.
First, I want to thank Eric for putting this panel together. Most of the panels in our profession, are monochromatic. Everyone agrees with one another. And here, it is not just Fred against the liberals. I mean, we all differ amongst each other, and so I want to thank you for allowing this dialogue. I'm going to talk mostly about post-World War II liberalism, which some people call welfare liberalism. I don't call it that, in part because I think it shrinks the nature of the New Deal changes. And I agree with Fred that liberal politicians lost the support of the working classes, but I have a slightly different analysis on the cause of the disengagement. But before I do this, I would like to talk about the prehistory, that is before World War II, and the method. Fred sets up a series of individuals, journalists mostly, who form a liberal tradition. I would edit the phrase to read, quote, "some liberal intellectuals at some moments of their lives," end quote. First, these thinkers did not acknowledge each other. And the examples, Randolph Bourne, Herbert Crowley, H.L. Mencken, Waldo Frank, Edmund Wilson, seem arbitrary. Where is John Dewey? Moreover, each is more complicated than Fred makes them out to be. Listen to Herbert Crowley's critique of bureaucracy in defense of democracy. Quote, "If given sufficient power, bureaucrats will use it to perpetuate the system which is so beneficial to themselves." Fred is right about Crowley in the 20s, where he, like other intellectuals, lose faith in his countrymen. But that speaks to the nature of intellectuals, not liberalism. And I think there are very few people who wrote in the 20s who would bear reading today. Part of the problem is that liberalism, unlike Marxism, lacks of a foundational text. Although it is marked everywhere by a belief in individual freedom, the conditions for sustaining this freedom have changed over time. Sometimes a market economy, other times state regulation. Givens like religious toleration, a government constrained by law and legitimized by popular consent, are essential, but still open to interpretation. In short, the meaning of individual freedom and foundations for it have shifted over time in response to changing economic and political conditions. Thus, establishing a tradition is difficult. Fred abstracts one theme, disillusionment with American society, which he sometimes calls mass democracy, middle-class capitalism, or commercial society. But often business and democracy are conflated, and distinctions between middle and working class erased. At other times, Fred talks about a sensibility such as reflex anti-business sentiment. These insights, and they are genuinely good insights, but isolated from a program, resources, constituencies, and parties, cannot stand alone as liberalism. Moreover, in the early 20th century, it was not only progressive liberal intellectuals who had misgivings about the people. Elites across the political spectrum doubted the virtues of the working class and the ethnic and racial peoples who composed it. Leaders of ethnic and racial groups often shared elite judgment about their poor brothers and sisters. W.E.B. Du Bois's belief that it was the talented tenth that would lead African Americans was only the most famous statement of the beliefs of the age. I have argued elsewhere that these views followed from the defeat of expressions of popular power in the 1890s, black republicanism, trade unionism, populism, and socialism. The working classes were both mute and menacing. This would change permanently with the New Deal. Henceforth, the open expression of contempt for the populace would be confined to private gatherings or the South until the 1960s. Elite intellectual and working class alliances would always be contingent and shifting. It had to do with ideas and interests as well as prejudice and sensibility. In the 60s, Fred points to the upstairs-downstairs marriage of liberal elites and groups like the Black Panthers. These post-New Deal arrangements were more contingent than Fred allows, and liberal elites abandoned this alliance in the 1980s when it condemned a black underclass. These shifts and disarrays of the late 20th century, to me, had more to do with the economic challenges faced by the nation in a more open global economy than any genetic basis for liberalism. Let me try now to define post-war liberalism, and then what I'll do is try to show where Fred and I agree.
Here comes the board.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Wow. Okay.
I'm old,
It's okay.
I'm gay, I'm of color. So you have the whole sample here.
Okay, may I continue?
Oh yes, please do.
Okay. Okay. The way I look at post-war liberalism is that after the New Deal, most Americans believed that individual freedom was rooted in high wages, which required capital regulation to obtain prosperity. During what was called the Age of Compression from 1947 to 1973, income and wealth were mildly redistributed even as economic growth soared. At the same time, the nation's leaders cemented Cold War alliances with foreign access to the U.S. market. We may call this strategic globalism. In 1945, U.S. economic superiority was so vast that these policies did not matter. Over time, they ultimately did. And when high oil prices and economic competition from Japan and Germany battered the economy in the 70s, new policies, international and domestic, were needed. Restoring growth was a project on the left and the right during the 1970s. No one would imagine that the productivity decline would continue until 1995 and that wage growth would continue to fall short of the achievements of the post-war years. Few predicted that U.S. trade deficits would remain and grow, producing the global imbalances between consuming nations, the U.S., and producing nations, China, that are at the root of the Great Recession. And here's where I share some of Fred's ideas. The Democratic Party, which enjoyed a 2-to-1 advantage over the GOP at the beginning of the 70s, was less responsive to the economy and to workers. New Democrats, often from suburban affluent districts, made it a badge of honor that they were not New Dealers, and often blamed the working class, mostly the white male part of it, for the evils they saw about them. Coming of age during the affluent 60s, they believed that post-economic issues, foreign policy, race, gender, political process, and environment were the important ones. By occupation, they were often unconnected to wealth-making or production-related activity. They ignored or misread the new industrial competition with Europe and Japan and the high energy prices that challenged the affluence that had kept the party together. The critical moments occurred in '79 and 1980 when a Democratic president chose in vain to battle inflation, not unemployment, and promote a balanced budget, not growth. Polls demonstrated that those who voted for the victorious Ronald Reagan did not do so because he was conservative, but because they had lost faith in the competency of Jimmy Carter to manage the economy. 4 years later, when Mondale lost, polls showed that the population agreed with him and the Democrats on issues of poverty, race, and gender, but not on his ability to produce prosperity. Once upon a time, Democrats campaigned as the party of prosperity, and the GOP was the party of the Great Depression. No more. The new GOP affirmed that capital freed from taxation, regulation, and trade barriers would produce national, labor, and individual prosperity. The effects of such policies in a global economy shifted resources away from manufacturing, the tradables, into finance and housing. This recipe, aided by high-tech innovations, worked for a while, especially during the Clinton years, even as it produced the age of inequality. Deregulation, reduced government spending, capital, and trade liberalization became the new conventional wisdom. After the dot-com bust, financing from abroad allowed Americans to maintain consumption despite stagnating wages and huge trade deficits. Recently, this model has failed to sustain its foremost selling point, prosperity. Signature industries, housing, and financial services placed the world on the edge in the fall of 2008, and we are still living in that world. Both the post-war order and the current neoliberal one sought prosperity in a way to foster individual freedom, but with different recipes. The new order replaced the assumption that capital and labor should prosper together with an ethic claiming that the promotion of capital will eventually benefit labor, a very different way of running a nation that produced very different results. The bank bailouts and the Fed policy of buying assets is supported by liberal intellectuals like Paul Krugman, as well as the more conservative Ben Bernanke and now the more liberal Janet Yellen, to reveal a consensus. The Great Recession shook the neoliberal consensus but did not dislodge it.
Okay, thanks. Ira is next? Yes.
Well, I'm going to read few sentences from the book, which I think signify for me why I was both seized by the book and perplexed by it. Liberalism, page 197, which began as a literary construct in the wake of World War I, reached its political apex with the election of Barack Obama, whose personal history is crafted in dreams from my father, was a literary construct. And then I wrote the following sentence for myself. Conservatism, American conservatism, which began as a literary construct in the wake of World War I, reached its political apex with the election of Ronald Reagan, whose personal history has been crafted by many as a literary construct.
I would agree with that.
Yes, okay. So, we're not yet disagreeing.
Not yet.
Not yet. Be patient. But the seized part was to try to make sense of either liberalism or conservatism as primarily or first and foremost or considerably or centrally, not words you use but which are implied, as a literary construct, which made me ask, what are these things called liberalism and conservatism? And second, what does it mean that we could substitute, if you agree with me, as you said you did, that we could substitute the word conservatism for liberalism? Does that mean that at a more abstract level, you wish to argue that any ideological construct, and here I'd be prepared to agree with within limits, can be constructed as a literary construct? Well, of course it can, but I would put the point slightly differently, maybe not necessarily in a contradictory way yet. If you think of any, now we're talking, let's be clear, I mean, I think it's a powerful feature of the book that we're talking about ideologies, whether liberal or conservative, in the American case, in the context of mass democracy. That's the frame of the book. That's what its temporality is all about. It would be different talking about these ideologies in 1820 as opposed to 1920, let alone approaching 2020. So if we think about ideological constructs, the part this book is about is what I would call dispositions. How are structural transformations and people's experiences of those transformations made sense of through what you're calling literary, others might call ideological, others might call simply acts of signifying, but the creation of dispositions. Now, a disposition is a disposition not only to understand experience embedded in structure, but is a sense of disposition in the sense of disposed to action. So ideologies are key pivots between an interpretation of the social world and people's experiences of it, and a willingness to act. Now, by stressing the literary dispositional part, Fred raises two big questions. How much weight to give it in the history of any ideology, whether, in this case, American liberalism or not? How much emphasis, how important is it that we understand what this group of intellectuals had to say? And under what conditions do they set the tone as opposed to many other actors with dispositions, including people at the center of political life itself? I'm thinking, I've spent some time with the New Deal. There were tens of people who were not just like Mencken or Bourne and others, who had ideas, who reflected on the structures and experiences of modern America, and who were disposed to act in certain ways. Some of us think of them as formative liberals in the making of modern America. But how much weight will we put on their ideas or on this set of persons' ideas? So there is a double whammy question here, which I found unresolved in the book. It's implicitly, the answer is implicit, and sometimes even explicit, but unresolved. First, how much weight do we want to put on this level of dispositions? And then, what selection criteria legitimate the selection of these individuals as opposed to others? I put and Judith's already made this point, I put the issue somewhat differently, which goes the following. It seems to me that in a mass democracy that is a democracy at a moment when the modern state becomes big and protean, inevitably there is going to be a tension between those who approach the modern democratic state as experts, as people who have particular authority and skills and devoted to structuring the state, solving problems in the state, making policy for the state, and those who are deeply embedded, sometimes they're overlapping categories, but deeply embedded in the electoral game of winning 50% plus one. And we're always going to find a set of tensions in any ideological configuration in a mass democracy between those who privilege the top-down authoritative policy world and those who in some sense are populists in the sense of mobilizing the population. So if we look at contemporary American conservatism, I could easily, not with difficulty, find many people. You just have to read National Review of the 1950s and compare it to your liberals of the 1950s. The same contempt for ordinary citizens, the same sense that we know better than the people who are voting for other folks, the same sense that something was really lost with the growth of mass society. It's not unique to liberals. And at the same time, you would find amongst liberals a deep appreciation for the people, whether in the form of labor, in the form of ordinary citizens, in the form of ethnic groups and migrants. All this is missing from the book. That part of liberalism, just as in conservatism, you can find appeals to the people through different lenses, whether they're through the evangelical churches or other kind of mass mobilizations. You will find both, and I, therefore, am not prepared to conclude that there's something distinctive, unique, special, and in some sense, this book implies sick, about the American liberal tradition. I've been a critic of I am a liberal of a certain kind, but also quite critical of the American liberal tradition, but not because it uniquely is, as the subtitle says, or as the title says, is a revolt against the masses. There's a revolt against the masses in American conservatism, just as there's a cathecting with masses in American conservatism, there's a revolt against the masses in American liberalism, and there's a cathecting with the masses in American liberalism. Missing, too, is what I would call an institutional dimension of analysis. Where is the analysis of the forms that liberalism took, whether bottom-up, as in the labor movement, or top-down in the Democratic Party? It appears from time to time, but not systematically. So I think that there's a kind of, in this, what I would call a lawyer's brief history, a kind of selection of, to make a case. It's a powerful case, but a very limited case, because it implies that there's something distinctive about liberals that is not true more broadly in democracies, or in this democracy, and it focuses on the elitist part without focusing on the other part. It would be like writing a history of American conservatism only in a kind of a nostalgia for the ancien regime before people got the vote, without noticing that American conservatism is also a deeply popular and populist movement. It commits that sin, in my view. And I'd like to end by simply saying that I'm uneasy about some key aspect of the use of the word liberalism. Of course, it refers to a tendency in American life, and that is perfectly fine. But what is liberalism? That is, we could spend hours together talking about this. But to end by saying, it seems to me that there's a sense in which, as Hartz put it, though however controversially, all Americans are liberals, that you will not find in the American polity a legitimate position that doesn't accept core values like government by consent, rule of law, political representation, individual rights. Our debates, from this angle of vision, are not about liberal and conservative, they're about what kind of liberalism to have. And that means what kinds of linkages should be fashioned between the modern state and the economy, between the modern state and civil society, between the modern state and other states. And those are the zones in which we get contestation in American life. We get contestation about those questions inside our traditions. Liberals don't all agree with each other. Conservatives don't all agree with each other. And between liberals and conservatives. And finally, American liberalism has never been pure, in the sense that it's always modified. There are more conservative versions of liberalism, there are more radical versions. There are social democratic versions of liberalism. It's an enormously capacious category. So the book, to conclude in my view, has a double reduction. It reduces to liberalism something that excludes those who don't call themselves liberals in America, like most American conservatives, and within the frame of that is, I think we're all liberals in some deep sense. And second, within its treatment of liberalism, it reduces liberalism to the level of disposition, and at that level of dispositions, uniquely to those moments when intellectuals were contemptuous of the people in various forms. And I think that double reduction gives the book its power as a polemic. It's a very powerful polemic, but it also ultimately, at least to my taste, reduces aspects of its persuasiveness. Thank you.
Thank you, and Kornhauser.
What he said. No. Well, one point that probably bears making, given what I'm about to say, is that Ira was a very compelling teacher of mine on the subject of liberalism, so you may hear some echoes. What I am, though, is an intellectual historian, so I'm going to sort of talk at that level for a few minutes. Some of what I was going to say has already been said, so I'll try to skip over this part. I take this to be an intellectual and cultural history of modern American liberalism. And intellectual and cultural historians are generally either lumpers or splitters. I forget who first said that. But, lumpers like to generalize about an intellectual persuasion, ideology, orientation. Splitters prefer subcategories. Take liberalism. A lumper, like Fred, if you'll accept that, Fred, we can argue, seeks an essential core to the ism liberalism, which in his case is, as we've heard, an elitist antipathy towards the middle class and middle class values. A splitter finds differences within a given category of analysis so great as to overwhelm or nearly overwhelm the value of the category itself, liberalism, obviously in this case. Where the lumper identifies an essence, the splitter tends to tell illustrative stories. Just bear with me on this. Wikipedia is a splitter. Now, I just want you to know that I didn't look up liberalism in Wikipedia, curious about. I actually was looking up Ortega y Gasset in Wikipedia for other reasons, and I was curious, actually, if he was categorized as a liberal, which he was, but then on the side, there was this whole liberalism thing, so I decided to explore that, if you want to know more about liberalism. So there was a lot, people, okay, but I'm just going to tell you what Wikipedia says are the variants of liberalism. Ready? Anarcho-capitalism, classical, conservative democratic, green, liberal feminism, liberal, these categories are not quite parallel, but it's Wikipedia. Liberal internationalism, libertarianism, market, national, neoliberalism, ordo-liberalism, paleo-liberalism, radical centrism, radicalism, religious, secular, social, socialist. Okay. I'm going to let that list speak for itself. Maybe it speaks more about Wikipedia, but I think you get my point, which is that it is a very capacious category. Fred has acknowledged that, and Fred has also acknowledged at the very beginning of his book that he is not writing a comprehensive history of liberalism. But what I want to do for just a few minutes is raise the question about whether we even can talk about any meaningful category of liberalism, even though I've written a couple of encyclopedia entries that do just that. I never feel quite so comfortable with it. Let me first, though, mention two categories that are not in this very long list in Wikipedia that are in Fred's book that he shows relationships between, and that is liberalism and fascism, and communism. I don't disagree, actually, that there are relationships there, but I found them to be emphasized perhaps more than some other possible external relationships with liberalism and other isms. Okay, now I am a splitter when it comes to liberalism, and so when I write these encyclopedia articles, it's very hard for me because in those cases I'm asked to write about an American liberalism that persists through the entire history of the country. And I think Fred would agree here that such a liberalism is difficult, if not impossible, to identify, and he has not, to his credit, tried to do so, instead settling, as Ira pointed out, a historically situated modern American liberalism. Even within these boundaries, however, Fred acknowledges that liberalism was notably flexible and permeable compared to the other isms it competed with. And I think that's a very important point. Wikipedia's sort of absurdity notwithstanding. But I think, though, Fred, and I hope you'll correct me if I'm wrong later, means flexible and permeable over time, not necessarily across space, although maybe both. His liberalism over time is both cultural and political. Fred's radical and conservative, antipathetic toward masses and towards classes. And more and more, I wonder, not just reading Fred's book, but reading other books, and trying myself at one point actually to write about liberalism as a whole, whether, as Sheldon Wolin puts it, existing ideological categories do not tyrannize more than they explain. Is liberalism then even an ism, that is a coherent doctrine or dogma? I'm not so sure. And I even mean American liberalism here, okay? In fact, I tend to think not. There is no person, somebody made this point.
I did.
Mr. or Ms. Liberal, from whom it takes its cue, as Marxism does from Marx. There are no identifiable leaders of a liberal movement or political party, as there were in the case of fascism, for example. In fact, in the American case, there has, but for a brief moment in the 19th century, never been a political party that has explicitly called itself a liberal party, as in, say, England. The closest we have come is the Democratic Party of the 1930s, in which Roosevelt explicitly said this was a party of liberalism, though his subsequent definition of what he meant, and I'm looking, he says it more than once, but I'm looking in particular at his nomination speech here, sounded more utilitarian than anything else, the greatest good for the greatest number. So I'm not sure it was, in this sense, Fred is onto something when he says it's a sensibility as much as anything, I think, in American political culture. That's what Roosevelt was grasping. It's not progressivism, I think, was his main point. Now, there are many things one can lump together as an intellectual or cultural historian. People and ideas are the two most obvious candidates. Fred lumps together people. And in one sense, I think you could say that his group of liberals is expansive, ranging from Herbert Croly to Gassett to Ortega Gasset to Mencken to Schlesinger to Sontag to politicians such as Jesse Jackson, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama. And then I had a list of people who he didn't mention, but we've done that, so I won't do that. Let me be clear, though, that there's no inherent benefit, in my view, from being comprehensive. And it's quite possible that Fred's book, his story of liberalism, would be the poorer for it. However, it may be instructive to think about how including figures that aren't included here would change the story. And I would say, broadly speaking, liberalism would become less ideological, that is, less dogmatic, more variegated. The qualities of flexibility and adaptability that Fred acknowledges would become more relevant. So I think what Fred is telling here actually is a story of ideological liberalism, a liberalism that's very self-conscious about its critique, in this case, of the middle class, of democracy, etc. Fred writes, for example, it's liberals' claim to be an aristocracy based on talent and sensibility that helped define the 60s and 70s, which in turn, my words, gave birth to Obama, literally and figuratively. He was born in the 60s. So it's a story, right, an ideological liberalism, I think, that starts in the 20s and in effect ends in the 70s, but then reverberates in various iterations since then. I just want to maybe make this a little more concrete, this idea that if you add different kinds of liberals, the story might change a little bit. By talking for a minute about a liberal intellectual who sounds a lot like Fred, but does not fit into his cultural box, apparently, and that is Christopher Lasch. Lasch and many others I could name illuminate a particularly vexing problem with anything we might call modern American liberalism, namely its relationship to democracy, itself a multifarious concept. So Lasch had much the same criticism of liberalism that you can find in Fred's book. In his most comprehensive book, Lasch's, that is, The True and Only Heaven, Lasch lamented the, quote, sensibility of the petty bourgeoisie was, quote, difficult to recognize as such in major thinkers only because we expect major thinkers to participate in the general revulsion against the petty bourgeois way of life, end quote. These particular thinkers, Lasch continued, quote, embodied the conscience of the lower middle class, that is his people, right, his liberals, generally speaking. They embodied the conscience of the lower middle class, giving voice to its distinctive concerns and criticizing its characteristic vices of envy, resentment, and servility. Notwithstanding these vices, the moral conservatism of the petty bourgeoisie, its egalitarianism, its respect for workmanship, its understanding of the value of loyalty, and its struggle against the moral temptation of resentment are the materials on which the critics of progress, which is Lash's bête noire, have always had to rely if they wanted to put together a coherent challenge to the reigning liberal orthodoxy. Those that middle, what he calls lower middle class values, have to be mobilized against what he calls an elitist liberalism. He continues one more quote here. Liberals have lost sight of what is valuable in lower middle class culture in their eagerness to condemn what is objectionable. Their attack on middle America, which eventually gave rise to a counterattack against liberalism, by which he means the new right, has blinded them to the positive features of petty bourgeois culture, its moral realism, its understanding that everything has its price, its respect for limits, its skepticism about progress. Whatever can be said against them, they are, quote, unlikely probably to mistake the promised land of progress for the true and only heaven. In other words, they're not wild-eyed utopians, right? Now, this is not exactly Fred's argument, of course, but it shares important elements. Most notably, the liberals' disdain for middle class values and way of life, and the price it has had to pay because of that disdain. Yet Lash may, with good reason, I think, be called a liberal. He's a tough one to categorize, and as I said, I think these categories are themselves problematic. But what I just want to highlight something that's in Lash that's not in Siegel, and really Ira's already said this, but I'm going to elaborate just a tiny bit. And that's small d democracy. For Lash and others like him, of the participatory type, and don't read SDS into that, he means local, not necessarily through formal democratic institutions, sometimes social movements, but actual participation in political life. Yes, Lash hated elitism, what had become of academia, the new class, Reichstag, the obsession with cultural and racial diversity, and many other things for which Fred also expresses a distaste. In fact, his last book was entitled The Revolt of the Elites and the Betrayal of Democracy. Here, Lash renews his critique of urbane elites whose addiction to cosmopolitanism has disconnected them from the local, from loyalties, and from middle America. Only Lash, writing in the 1990s, attributes this trend to ideological turns of both the left and the right. Again, a point that's made. I won't skip his quote. The point is that Lash is offering much the same critique as Fred, does two things differently, both of which, in my view, place into question our ability to generalize about liberalism, even modern American liberalism. First, Lash finds a shared elitism in the hardened versions of both liberalism and conservatism, throwing into question, sorry, I just repeated myself, the relationship between the two in the American context. This then is about the boundaries of liberalism. Second, Lash finds a strain within liberalism that defended democracy against the charge that it, quote, fostered mediocrity, self-indulgence, and excessive love of comfort, sloppy workmanship, and a timid conformity to prevailing opinion. Liberalism really takes its lumps, doesn't it? For inspiration, though, Lash looks to Dewey, Randolph Bourne, Martin Luther King, among others. So in some of the same people Fred finds problematic, and then some others as well. One more quick example of the imbrication of democracy and liberalism. Fred rightly finds fault with much of mass culture theory and even mass society theory. Interestingly, so does Lash. But not all of this theory was a jeremiad about the unthinking, malleable, authoritarian masses. Some mass society theorists, you know where I'm coming from here, but worried about massification, but saw a pluralistic civil society which existed in the United States as supporting liberal democracy. Strong social institutions could produce democracy even in the wake of totalitarianism. Now, to his credit, while the orbit of people Fred lumps together may be vast, the planet liberalism that they circle around is a consistent and carefully drawn liberal persuasion that does not itself threaten to overspill the bounds of logical consistency. Modern American liberalism, cultural in the first instance, political in the last, is more than anything else about values, behavior, sensibilities. Fred is writing about the id, as he says, of liberalism that animates the ego of its politics, the cultural and emotional attachments, as he puts it, that drive its political goals. He writes of its cultural shape, a search for status, and similar kinds of tropes. Liberalism, in his telling, is more about style and attitude, or at least as much about style and attitude than substance and institution building. And while I might yearn for more parsing and more discussion of actual political positions, this book goes a long way, I believe, in explaining the left liberalism of the 1960s and its reverberations since, as well as the problematic aftermath of that liberalism, which too often hurts political liberalism and distracts liberals from the true problems at hand. I don't know if this is, as Fred puts it, the actual history of liberalism, a concept I've suggested that probably cannot be historically specified as a totality liberalism, but it is one history of liberalism that is sure to animate a healthy debate for some time to come.
Okay, thank you. I will make a few more comments. Much of what I planned to say has already been said in one form or another, even though we didn't plan our comments collectively here. The Revolt Against the Masses is a short book. It's only about 200 pages. Therefore, it's not very hard to talk about things that are not in it, and that's not really what I'm going to do, except a little bit. But it really consists of two parts. The first part, as you have heard, is a very interesting, provocative account of elitism and alienation from mass culture among early 20th century intellectuals, H.G. Wells, Herbert Croly, Randolph Bourne, H.L. Mencken, who, as we have heard, according to Fred, kind of create the DNA, so to speak, of modern liberalism. The second part, which does go into, in some way, some of the actual issues that Anne was mentioning, is a sort of polemic against more modern liberalism, and the social impact of their ideas and policies since World War II. The connection between the two is not always clear to me. And the second part is more of a shotgun approach, I think, hitting a large range of targets very briefly, ranging from belief in global warming to liberals' criticisms of highbrow television culture in the 1950s that Fred thinks explains why you can't watch ballet on TV anymore. Throughout, the book is very well written and lively. The writing is lively and aphoristic. He's got a wonderful penchant for the kind of telling turn of phrase. One, just to pull one out of a hat, where he says, upper-class liberals refuse to preach what they practice. That is, their lives exemplify steady work, stable family life. The only people who get married nowadays are upper-class people, apparently, and according to statistics. But they refuse to prescribe this for the poor, even though they live one way, but they don't tell people how they ought to live. Now, what is liberalism anyway? I mean, everyone has sort of been raising this question about the book. Fred tells us a lot about liberal ideas and sensibility, but not as much about liberal policies. The section on the New Deal of the 30s is about H.G. Wells, Mencken, and Sinclair Lewis, not FDR, John L. Lewis, or other political figures of that period. Now, to me, but that, I think, it poses a problem of definition here. The meaning of liberalism has changed over time. For example, as Ira has shown recently, in the 1930s, one could be a legitimate New Deal liberal and also a rank segregationist, which is not possible in the modern age. But for me, one baseline of liberalism in the 20th century is, and here I guess I'm going back to Arthur Schlesinger, belief in using governmental power to counteract excessive corporate power and to mildly redistribute wealth in the country. I raise this not to put forth an abstract definition of liberalism, but to ask the question, do we actually live in a liberal regime today? Is Obama a liberal? Fred says we do live in a liberal regime, and Obama is the quintessential that his election is the apex of liberalism. Frankly, I do not see Obama as a liberal. I see him as a descendant of anti-liberal Democrats, the Democratic Leadership Council, or whatever they call themselves in the 1990s, the Clintonians, And I don't think they are liberal, at least in the economic sense. Yes, culturally they are, gay marriage, women's rights, yes, on those issues they are liberal. But economically, I believe we are still living in the age of Reagan, basically. And that's, I want to focus for a second on the subtitle, How Liberalism Has Undermined the Middle Class, because the book is not just an intellectual history. It has an argument about what the practical effects on American society have been of liberalism. The middle class is in trouble nowadays, as we read in the newspapers, but I don't honestly think you can blame that on liberalism. The policies that have undermined the prospects of the middle class date from the 1980s, from the age of Reagan. They are promoting redistribution, but upward, not downward. You can't address the question of the undermining of the middle class without talking about deindustrialization. Judy, of course, talked about this a little, the financialization of the economy, taxing and spending policies that are less and less redistributive, and the decline of labor unions. All of this the result of policies pursued by both parties for the last 30 years or so, but certainly not distinctively liberal in any sense. The New York Times the other day had an interesting series of charts about what happened to the income generated by economic growth after various recessions in the last 30, 40, 50 years. And those charts show very clearly that the current pattern that we have today of most of the benefits of economic growth going to the top 10% of income earners began in 1982 with Reagan's tax and spend and deregulation policies. My point is simply that blaming liberals for the decline of the middle class lets a lot of other culprits off the hook. Oddly, and somebody mentioned this, in a book on liberalism, there is virtually no mention of labor unions, except for public sector unions. But labor, private sector labor, was a key component of 20th century liberalism. And even today, the closest correlation among working class people in terms of voting Democratic is membership in a union, and indeed holding liberal values. Membership in a union correlates more closely with holding various liberal positions than almost any other thing. I don't see how labor unions fit into the pattern, the definition of liberalism that is advanced in this book. I don't believe it's possible to argue that unions disdain ordinary Americans, disdain popular culture. Maybe unions of faculty do, but most others I don't think do. But they have played a critical role in the history of liberalism in the period that the book is talking about. Ira mentioned that this elitism that Fred is talking about, or disdain for mass culture, mass society, mass democracy, was certainly present can be found in conservatism in the 1950s. You mentioned National Review. One of my odd foibles is to watch Fox TV, and when driving around, which I do a lot, listening to right-wing call-in shows. And believe me, if you want to hear contempt for the ordinary American, tune in to those shows. The people are brainwashed by the liberal media. They don't want to work. Most Americans are lazy. They're takers. They're intimidated by blacks, by feminists, by others. They can't think for themselves. In other words, alienation from the people, so to speak, is not a distinguishing characteristic of liberalism. Ira mentioned this. It may exist among liberals. Fred has demonstrated this pretty clearly. But it is not what makes liberalism distinct in a society where many, many people seem to express that same kind of alienation when they are on the losing side. When they're on the winning side, they think the people are great, and they've really got all the insight. But when Obama was elected and then re-elected, believe me, anything that you could read in this book from Mencken and from all the others in the 20s about the degradation of the American people, you can find in conservative explanations of Obama's two victories. So I think a very interesting book could be written on political leaders, political leadership in general, and the almost inevitable strain of elitism among them, about the very complicated, very difficult relationship of the modern administrative state with ordinary citizens, about the conundrum in a democracy of protecting the rights of minorities, something that inevitably casts the state as the opponent of many local practices and cultures, about how social movements, liberal, conservative, or other kinds, seem to almost inevitably begin with a sense of being in the minority and therefore a kind of stance of distance from mass culture. Read the abolitionists about, in the early days, about how Americans were kind of corrupted, the public was corrupted by the presence of slavery, the churches were corrupted, public opinion was corrupted, the political parties were corrupted. Minority movements sort of almost have to feel that they are at odds with the larger culture. Fred's book is a step, and an important one, toward this larger picture, and I hope that even though he thinks he's retired, that he will expand his focus to write the next book about all across the political spectrum and this phenomenon that is represented in the book, how it plays out, not just among liberals, but in many other ways as well. So thanks to everybody for their comments. I'm now going to turn the floor back over to Fred Siegel for a little bit to give whatever commentary you want to give on the comments, and then we will throw the floor open for questions.
I'm just going to respond very briefly to a few specific points. Where is John Dewey? When I began writing this book, I thought about John Dewey, how important he was to my undergraduate education, and how I haven't heard of him in 20 years. No one refers to John Dewey. There was a book by a guy named Robert Westbrook, which unfortunately was not well written or well argued, that tried to bring Dewey back up, but Bill Bradley tried to bring Dewey, but it flopped. Dewey has disappeared from the larger liberal discourse. We haven't talked about environmentalism. Environmentalism is crucial to this change, because the environmentalism of the 70s was opposed to what we had traditionally thought of as economic progress. Environmentalists did not want economic growth. Economic growth was bad. It is still the case. We look at the Keystone Pipeline business today. It is still bad. We have millionaires, or in the case of Tom Steyer, billionaires against economic growth, billionaires against the Keystone Pipeline. We can get into that more if you want to talk about it. Environmentalism is a key component of modern liberalism. It means that modern liberalism is not about how we expand the pie anymore, except in a redistributive sense. Turning to Ira for a second. Ira, H.L. Mencken. H.L. Mencken is not known among contemporaries as a liberal. But in the 1920s, he was the most important liberal in America. If I'm in a room with people and I ask, who's the most important liberal in America, I ask people to raise their hand. I say H.L. Mencken. I say, this was common understanding. Now, he wasn't a liberal in the modern sense. He hated Roosevelt. But in the 1920s, his disdain for the bourgeoisie, his admiration for German culture, not the German army, but German, actually he admired both, was central to the creation of modern, and it didn't go away. Anthony Lewis, who I despised reading for all those years, even when I was much to the left of center, I thought Anthony Lewis was not so swift, loved Mencken. He was the fount of Lewis's liberalism, and he acknowledged that. And as for these cultural figures, the closest thing to Sinclair Lewis on the right is Ayn Rand. They're both unreadable for similar reasons, actually, because they're really polemics. But if in growing up, and I grew up among, as most people my age did, in living in the five boroughs, growing up entirely among liberals, they all had Sinclair Lewis on their shelves. Not Ayn Rand, but Sinclair Lewis, and they all read It Can't Happen Here. And as late as 2006, Paul Krugman, the benighted character who writes for the Times, writes a comic book on the editorial pages. Excellent. Krugman evoked It Can't Happen Here. It has happened here, he said. George Bush has produced fascism in America. Now, granted, he's not the brightest guy, despite some of the comments. Nonetheless, this is 2005. He still thinks it can't. And David Axelrod refers to referred to Romney as an Elmer Gantry-like figure. Sinclair Lewis left a deep, deep imprint, even deeper than Ayn Rand. And I think Ayn Rand's imprint on the Republicans has been mostly malign. Let me go on. Ira points out that in the 1950s, there were a lot of right-wingers who had disdain for the mass culture. Absolutely true. That changes in 1965. Two things happen in 1965. One is John Lindsay is elected mayor of New York, and one of the people he defeats is a guy named William Buckley. Buckley wanted to write a book updating Ortega Gasset's Revolt of the Masses. Now, he was about to write this. Well, he says he was about to. Who knows? He talked about writing this for many years, but he goes to Queens and he discovers that the lower middle class, working class Catholics of Queens support him, and the upper middle class Catholics, Jews, and Protestants of Manhattan despise him. His whole worldview is shaken, and modern conservatism is shaped by Buckley's experience. It's also shaped by the first top-bottom alignment in American politics, right here in New York with John Lindsay in 1965. We here in New York are really at the center of a lot of, and I've gotten criticisms elsewhere that in California, well, people don't actually read in California, but people, sorry. My sister-in-law, who I'm very close, lives there. She still doesn't read. I have hopes. In any case, 65 is a crucial moment in the creation of modern liberalism and modern conservatism. Moving to Ortega himself. Ortega Gasset writes a new preface for Revolt Against the Masses in 1937. And he writes this for a trip to Germany. The book is reissued in Germany. No mention of Adolf Hitler, no mention of Nazism. What he denounces in 1937 is American mass culture. He still thinks it's the worst. And on the French right, and this is what I say, we picked up, liberalism picked up the worst elements of the European right and left. The argument was, in the early 30s, in the French right, that the great danger facing France was not Nazi Germany, it was American popular culture. This sentiment, and I won't bore people with, there's a man named Joseph Woods Crutch. How many people still know who Joseph Woods Crutch is? Not too many. Okay, a few. Woods Crutch saw this. It was interesting. He was one of the very few people who saw this. And he's an interesting writer on environmental topics. Let me turn to Anne and Kit Lash. I admired Kit Lash. I enormously enjoyed talking to him. And I once wrote an article called "The Agony of Christopher Lash," and it was all-out, no holds barred attack on Lash. And much to my surprise, next time I saw him, he told me I was right. This is when he was in the process of sort of shifting his worldviews. What I didn't like about The True and Only Heaven, which was never actually finished because of his health problems. He never polished it. Lash was a stylish writer, and that book is not. Is his hatred of progress. He sounds like the most extreme environmentalist. You remember in the 1970s, the environmentalists believed that population growth would destroy the world? It didn't happen. I won't carry this further to today. We'll get too heated. But Kit Lash, also in The True and Only Heaven, has great admiration for Sorel. Sorel, who creates a mass popular version of Nietzsche. He's a kind of Nietzschean of the right. Or I don't know whether Sorel is left or right. But Kit doesn't know what to make of him, and he writes about him in an admiring way. So I find it a True and Only Heaven an unfinished book. I wish he had lived. I wish what he thought. We get to the present, to what Eric talked about. 8 of the 10 wealthiest counties in America voted for Barack Obama. 8 of the 10, by overwhelming majorities. Wall Street has done wonderfully under Mr. Obama. Main Street has not done so well. Now, the DLC, Eric mentioned the DLC. This is the neuralgic point for me, since I was one of the thinkers behind the DLC. So I know
So
he wants.
you are responsible for Obama.
Obama put the DLC out of business. They folded. The people who supported Obama hated the DLC. They hated Al Frank. They hated Will Marshall. They hated me. Obama, the DLC was big on welfare reform. Obama hated it. They were big on quality of life policing. Obama hated it. Obama has nothing to do with it. Whatever Eric says, we can
For
debate.
free trade, which
What?
he's for.
But, okay. That's a fair point. No, it's a fair point. But on a whole range of political issues, Obama saw himself as a break, as a severe break. And if you go back to the 2008 campaign, the early years, he goes out of his way to demean the DLC.
But he put them all in charge of the economy when 2009 came along. All the
He put some of them. No, not all of them. And
He talked about change, but then there was no change.
They didn't. First of all, they didn't last for very long. Second of all, and this is important on the economy, Eric. I sat around the table with the DLC for many years, arguing against corporate subsidies. The DLC issued a dozen papers arguing against corporate, money for arguing against crony capitalism, money for fat cats. Fat cats have never done better than under Obama. Crony capitalism has thrived. So this is a break. You're right. I mean, Gene Sperling and Bruce Reed, but they broke with their own past in order to work. Now, and this will get a lot of boos. When the Tea Party began talking about the bailouts, they were entirely right. The first bailouts were defensible. We can get into that. The second set of bailouts were just indefensible. They were just giveaways to President Goldman. There's a joke that Obama's President Goldman Sachs. They were just giveaways to Goldman Sachs and others. Now, we've done well on this in New York. I can't complain about this. My wife's in real estate. She was fortunate enough to get out of academia when the getting was good, and we've done well with this. But this has not been good for the country. And just one last point. Oh yeah, unions. The shift in the AFL-CIO from private sector to public sector unions was tremendously significant, because private sector unions have an interest in the overall well-being of the economy. They want the economy to do well so they can get more. Public sector unions don't care whether the economy does well. They just want their cut. They want their cut of public sector funds. And that shift in the Democratic Party is part of what Obama represents. I argue Obama is the confluence of public sector unionism. And Andrew Stein of SEIU has argued, and I think quite correctly, the public sector unions are the most powerful political force in the country.
But Fred, why?
Why? Because, let's take two things. Money, they contribute more money than any other group, even more than academics. No, his number one academic contributor was the University of California, Berkeley. I think Harvard was 4, and I think Columbia was 12 in contributing. But public sector unions contribute more money to political campaigns than any other group in the United States by far. And now I lost the second point. And say that again.
Sorry. Why? Oh no, I was curious. You're saying that public sector unions have become,
And the second reason, and Eric knows a great deal about this. The hospital workers here in New York elected De Blasio. Now, why? They are the best vote polling operation we've ever seen. It used to be the Democratic Party was a vote polling operation. The Democratic Party doesn't exist anymore in New York. The Working Families Party exists in New York. The Working Families Party is in large measure made up of unions like the SEIU, which has incorporated the hospital workers. They are fantastic on election day. They pull the people out, because most of the people they're pulling out work for the city, directly or indirectly. So they're a political juggernaut in New York City and New York State, and nationally, they're crucial to Obama's election in 2008 and 2012. I think I've ranted on long enough.
All right, thank you. I want to thank you. We have time for questions and comments, and okay, Professor Blake, we will.
I've not read Fred's most recent book, but I've read a lot of your work. I've learned a lot from you over the years. I've disagreed with you at times over the years. Some of what you presented just now is reminiscent of earlier writings and reminds me quite a bit of the Survey of American Political History that you published several years ago, the title of which I'm sorry I forgot. But I want to make a number of points. First of all, there obviously is a strain of elitism in modern American intellectual history. Many people have written about it, including myself.
Can you speak louder?
There is obviously a strain of elitism in American intellectual history, among intellectuals on the left. Many people have written about it. I've written about it myself. I think you're making Mencken do too much work for you. There is a Menckenite moment in the 20s, and I think we do need to try to understand why Mencken became a culture hero for people on the left. But let's remember, Mencken was a bigot, he was a racist, an anti-Semite. I don't see him.
Those were his good points.
I don't see him as a liberal in any way that we would recognize today. And by the 30s, he's already passé. So I think you're making Mencken do too much work for you in terms of the intellectual history of your argument. Another point, and you don't make reference to it, or you haven't made reference to it tonight, but this is an episode that, if I recall correctly, figures prominently in your survey of American political history, and that is the McGovern campaign of '72. Now, on some level, this would be an episode that would fit your argument perfectly. And I've long thought that someone, maybe someone has done this, should write a book about what became of the McGovern campaign operatives, people like Clinton and Gary Hart, who then became pioneers of neoliberalism, including the kind of DLC politics that you played such a role in.
No.
But if you look at the McGovern campaign in another way, how did McGovern get the Democratic nomination? It was as a result of a mass movement in opposition to the Vietnam War that was not simply a movement of liberal elites or of upper middle class elites. The mobilization of millions of Americans and millions of people around the world against the Vietnam War included an awful lot of working class people and people you would characterize as middle class. And to think otherwise is to erase a huge amount of that story, including, and this is a story that's often forgotten, the opposition to the war on the part of Vietnam veterans and people within the military, most of whom were working class, white, black, brown, Americans. Second point. My last point is that it seems to me that lurking in the background of your argument, maybe not even in the background, is the critique of the new class that we've heard from neoconservatives now for 40 years. And the new class, as it's defined by neoconservatives, is a rather limited group of people. It's liberal or lefty academics, it's teachers and teacher unions, it's social workers, it's experts who are managing the liberal state. That's how it's usually defined by neoconservatives. But I think that a broader definition of the new class needs to be part of this conversation. Here, actually, Lash is very useful because there is a professional managerial class that is generated by advanced capitalism over the course of the 20th century that includes the people who are making out like bandits today, who vote Republican, people who have taken their kids out of public schools, who live in gated communities, and who have essentially, in their own way, engaged in a revolt against the masses. Mitt Romney would be a good example of such a person, right? And then finally, a footnote. I was very close to Christopher Lash. The Truth Only Heaven was a finished, polished book. It was published 2 or 3 years before he died. Just a footnote.
I would disagree with on that last point, but that's fair enough. I would also disagree with you on about the point about Gary Hart and the McGovernites being an influence on the DLC. I was there from the start. They were despised.
How about Clinton?
Most of the Clintonites, the only thing they liked about Gary Hart was his role as a political operative. None of his ideas. That's not who Clinton was. Let me turn to the Mencken point, because I think the Mencken point I think gets to the heart of things. And by the way, thank you for the kind comments you made earlier, because your book had an enormous influence on me as well. I read it and reread it. Mike Gold, the author of Jews Without Money, was describing a moment in the early 30s, I think 1934. He's standing around at a Communist Party meeting, and he says, I could throw a rock and I would hit 30 in this room, and I would hit 30 people who had been Menckenites 5 years ago. In other words, the disdain for the bourgeoisie took right-wing forms, and then it took left-wing forms. Mencken played an enormous role, as did Sinclair Lewis, in fertilizing that disdain. I don't think I make him do too much work, because when I get to the 30s, I talk about Mencken, and if you read the book, you'll see I talk about Mencken and George Bernard Shaw as horses' asses, and representing a current in the 30s best forgotten. And just last point, Kerry. I didn't learn about the new class from neocons. I learned about them from Irving Howe, Mike Harrington. I was an editor of Dissent in those days, and from Daniel Bell. Those are the people I learned about the new class from, and I agree it can be a problematic concept, and I used it loosely.
I think what we will do is take a few comments rather than back forth. So yes, why don't you go ahead and I'll take a couple more.
I can understand your equating.
Did you call him Fred?
Yeah, he's allowed to speak.
I'm the only paying.
This is Fred support. He's an old friend. That's why they're going after each other. But yes, what's your point here?
I can't understand your equating Sinclair Lewis with Ayn Rand. If you read Babbitt and you read Main Street, quite contradicts everything you're saying, and nor does it in any way.
Freddie, I didn't equate them. I said that Ayn Rand is to conservatives what Sinclair Lewis is to liberals. I didn't say that they were similar.
No, I'm not saying that they're similar, but there is nothing in Sinclair Lewis's novels, at least the two I mentioned, that is in any way disparaging of the masses. And his address to the Nobel Prize Committee gives you a totally different impression.
Yes, Freddie and I have gone back and forth on email. We totally disagree.
Wait a minute, we're going to take several comments here. So let's say yes, sir, over there. Then we'll go around.
Fred, hi.
Hi,
I'm a little shocked and surprised, not like Claude Rains and Casablanca, but I'm somewhat really shocked and dismayed by your creating this historical survey of liberalism and just relating it like a social cultural tour of fiction and literature. When to me, liberalism was always part of a political, economic, social struggle for the enhancement of the welfare state, capitalism, as an alternative to the left of, let's say, communism and socialism. In this country, it was a struggle for minimum wage, social security, going from Roosevelt to Johnson, from Medicaid to Medicare under Johnson, and that's been at the heart of the struggle of liberalism, to make capitalism more humane, more tolerable. And I think one could do it as a historical cultural survey, but not to make that as the central mark or goal of what liberalism is about in American history surprises me, perhaps only at Columbia.
He's not a Columbia professor.
Stan, all I can suggest is please read the book.
I bought it.
Bought it. We're going to take a couple more comments.
Usually I don't buy it.
We're going to take a couple more comments that we get. Yes, sir, go ahead.
I'm Siegel, I'm just curious, in terms of the timeline, you said the New Deal sort of liberalism sort of runs out around 64, 65. So I'm curious how Johnson and like programs that he initiates and his advisors initiate in the mid-60s, how they sort of fit. Are they a sign of this mechanism coming to fruition, or are they like last gaps of a generation?
Neither. What I argued is the centrality of the New Deal as a cultural construct runs out in the mid-60s, not the administrative state. The administrative state keeps chugging along. And the problem we have under Obama now is the administrative state and the Constitution have problems with each other.
All right, down here, yes.
Yeah, I just want to say, I was, first, two comments. One, I was totally shocked by the comment you just made about liberalism being to help something about welfare state. What happened to John Locke, John Stuart Mill, all these people? I mean, it seems to me we're not talking about the history of liberalism. I mean, are we only talking about this phenomenon called American liberalism? And then this goes to what you were talking about, the permeability and flexibility of the term liberalism. It seems to me that liberalism is a boomer phenomena. I'm working on this issue of the gentry liberal. And it seems to me it's a boomer phenomena which is totally dissociated from the historical past of liberalism, that it's been Elizabeth Powers, I'll write for the Weekly Standard, commentary, so on. It seems to me that the 50s initiated an incredible advance in American prosperity and educated a generation like myself, who were the boomers, who have inaugurated this liberal ethos you're talking about in America. I was very struck by Ira's comment saying we're all liberals now, because I think prosperity does make us that way. Now, I know that a lot of people here think that the middle class is suffering, and I suppose economically they are suffering, but we have become used to lots of things that we didn't have before. And I think that has made us into liberals. I don't mean this in a political sense, I mean it in a socio-economic and ethical sense. And if you look at people like Christopher Lasch, I don't know when he would stand on gay marriage or abortion, but you can see that liberals always change with the times, okay? Now it's the environmental state. And all of these dispositions that you call them, they have social and institutional consequences. They always lead to more bureaucrats. They always lead to more government, for instance. Anyway, end of speech.
Okay, but thank you. Let's go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering if there was a way to maybe unify your critique with one of the points that the Professor Katznelson made. And that is, it seems to me you identify in the 1920s the same phenomena that Julian Benda is finding in France in the Raison d'Éclat. And that maybe what we're looking at is the recurrence of this sort of ethos of disgust for the bourgeoisie that's universal in the West after the First World War and the Second World War. And that it just becomes particularly virulent and recognizable among what we might call New Left or liberals, but that it's pretty present among intellectuals on both left and right. It's just it becomes particularly virulent and notable post-68 on one side.
So would you just identify yourself?
My name's Darren Staloff.
Darren, what's your last name, Darren?
Staloff.
Staloff.
Darren Staloff.
That's a very good. I want to know that because it's a very good point.
He's a Columbia PhD also.
But he teaches at City College.
City College, exactly.
Well, Darren, the only thing I would point out to you is one of the people I talk about in the book who doesn't get enough attention in terms of American liberalism is H.G. Wells. And Wells exemplifies what I think what you're saying is entirely right.
Okay, thank you. Who else has their hand up here? Yes, sir.
This is mainly a Fred. On the issue of you're saying that Obama's policies are at odds with the Constitution. We now have the most conservative Supreme Court in the history of the country, and yet they haven't knocked down any of Obama's policies. So how do you square your view of the Constitution with the conservative members of our Supreme Court? Let me just ask one other question. We seem to be having trouble defining liberalism. Michael Harrington defined it in terms of the parties. The Democratic Party is a liberal party with a conservative fringe. The Republican Party is a conservative party with a liberal fringe. If he was alive today, I think he'd forget the last part of that with respect to the Republican Party. Okay, maybe. Okay. So in terms of liberalism's policies, I mean, there's many groups that rate these policies. It used to be Americans for Democratic Action would rate every congressman on what % do they vote on liberal policies. It doesn't seem to me that hard to define liberalism in terms of governmental policies and actions taken by Congress.
Just two very quick points. One, Mike Harrington, who I knew very well, would always said, liberalism is the American form of socialism. Slowly getting to socialism, and that's how the early liberals. That's how liberals understood themselves. I have some quotes in the book to this effect. Secondly, as to the courts, Obama's administrative actions have been struck down 20 times by federal courts. The Supreme Court, in the case of Obamacare, was very careful, and it produced a bizarre decision on Obamacare, in which Obamacare turned out to be a tax only no one knew it. So I think this will play itself out.
But they will not apparently touch what I think is real infringement of the Constitution, which is on things like Guantanamo, civil liberties, surveillance on people.
Talk about that, because the Alien and Sedition Act, which is part of what produced liberalism to begin with, was so hated by liberals in the early 20s, is the basis on which Fox reporter James Rosen was investigated, on which AP had its files pulled by the Justice Department. The Alien and Sedition, not the Alien. God, I'm going.
You're talking about the Sedition Act of World War I.
Sedition Act of World War I.
1798.
Yeah, I'm losing it.
One Sedition Act, another Sedition Act.
Those laws are still in effect, and they're being misused today as they were being misused then.
But the courts will not do anything about that,
No.
apparently.
No,
At least
so-
not.
With national security.
Well, not during a war, and this war is forever, so therefore they're not going to do it. I mean, that's
Probably right.
All right. Yes.
So I did recognize something in your argument which describes a kind of liberalism, but it seems that that's a kind of minority current within American liberalism, and it does represent a larger tradition of liberalism, but that's probably not in America, it seems to me, but in Europe. Specifically, in Europe after World War I, which is why Ortega y Gasset, I guess, also plays such a prominent role in your argument. That's where you start to see a large group of people who come from a 19th century liberal tradition really develop a strong antipathy against the masses. And to the extent that that tradition has influenced American political culture, it's maybe through people like Hayek and Mises who came over here. But that sentiment, it seems to me, was activated not by self-described American liberals, but by conservatives.
Oh, Hayek and Mises' influence comes much later. They do have an important influence, but I'm going to miss the guy. Who is the liberal the liberal in Italy who moves over to a quasi-fascist position? Gentile, thank you, thank you. But D.H. Lawrence, there's a famous poem by D.H. Lawrence on how despicable the bourgeoisie is, and that has enormous circulation in the 20s. It's a kind of cultural position. But what you're talking about, the Hayek von Mises, doesn't really hit until the 50s. This is all well developed.
But it does encapsulate the same post-World War I moment where, as soon as mass democracy and mass society come in, that's when liberals move hitherto.
No, Hayek. No, I'm sorry. You're misreading Hayek. Hayek is very much about World War II and not about World War I. About the coming of World War II and the Weimar Constitution, about which Anne has written a great deal. It's not about World War I. Von Mises has more of a World War I connection.
Upstairs.
Okay, over here. Yeah, go ahead.
Some commentators today have said there wasn't a foundational text for liberalism. I might be wrong here, but I didn't really read the book. I was intimidated by its length. It would be John Rawls's Theory of Justice. I was just asking if there was any talk about him, because I've heard in the abstract, liberal commentators have used his theory as a justification for liberal policies, so that should, I think, be discussed.
First of all, Rawls is enormously important, and Rawls was the answer to the problems associated with the administrative state, the lack of democratic consent associated with the administrative state. He seemed to provide a way to provide consent. But if anyone can show me a contemporary politician who's being influenced by Rawls, I want to know about it.
I do intellectual history.
We have a few more minutes if anyone else has a comment. Yes, go ahead. Sorry, my peripheral vision is lacking here. Go ahead.
Thank you for the panel discussion. I look forward to reading Fred's book. I've been a fan of much of his work. I want to pose a question, stipulating, of course, that modern conservatism and modern liberalism are terms that are subject to certain fluctuations, certain variations. Couldn't you say, we look at a practical trend, higher tax and spend states that tend to elect strong democratic majorities reflect modern liberalism, while lower tax and spend states that tend to elect stronger Republican majorities tend to be less liberal, more conservative. We have seen a migration, it's unmistakable, of people, jobs, home ownership from the so-called red states to the blue states. In fact, I think the last census, I might be slightly off, reflected that every state that picked up population except for Washington state was a red state. 1,000 people plus a day are moving to Texas. 1.2 million people, I think, moved out of New York, and the numbers go on. Can't you reach a generalization from there that the middle class is voting with their feet and showing that there is something about modern liberalism that they are fleeing from, that is a threat to them. And that the contrary ideology is something that is friendlier to them, that grows them, that grows their class. Just make that more practical observation.
I'd give you the very simple way to summarize what you just said. In 1960, there were 143 members of the House of Representatives from New York State. Today, there are 83. And that is the trend.
From New York, not from New York State.
New York State.
No. You must, not 83 members of the House of Representatives. 83 representatives?
At our
No.
height, we had 43 electoral votes.
We went from 45 representatives to 20, the lowest number since the 1810s in New York, and that reflects that trend, absolutely.
Drop everything I just said.
He was never a mathematician. He was a very good analyst.
No, it's definitely gone down, though. Yeah.
But that's not a causal relation.
Yeah, that is.
That's a correlation. That has nothing to do with anything.
Yeah, and a lot of the people moving into Texas are coming from Mexico, not from blue states. Anyway, was there a person over there? Okay, yes.
There's
It seems to me that your book is an example of the incoherence of liberalism and the tendency for it to be defined by people on the right. That there is no there at the moment. There are plenty of us who might self-identify as liberals, but I certainly do not recognize myself in anything that you've been talking about, or anything that the right in general has been defining my label as. I mean, it's ridiculous that we allow ourselves to be defined by you.
Well,
How do you know who he is, though?
no, but Fred. Oh, all right. We'll take. This will be the last comment. Then the panel will have a couple of little words, and that'll be that. Yes.
Don't talk down to us.
Who am I to talk down? This goes to several questions, but I want to think go to the heart of it. Is that, do you make a distinction between classical liberalism with a small L and liberalism with a large L? And what I think happens during this time is that you see a co-opting of the term and a battlefield for that term, getting into what, like Anne talked about, as far as plasticity of terms. And Mises and Hayek come later. What I think happens, and I want to get your opinion on this, Fred, is that it is H.L. Mencken said that only good bureaucrat is one with a gun at his head. Put it in his hand and there say goodbye to the Bill of Rights. It's also said about democracy that it's two wolves and a sheep fighting over what's for dinner. And so this aspect of Mencken and individualism versus collectivism, is it not a revolt against the masses, but the revolt against the concept of masses versus collectivism versus individualism?
Yes and no. When Mencken writes his book in 1926 about democracy, his contempt for the masses of New York City and Baltimore are thick. He has a personal disdain. It's not just this conceptual problem that he has. And he has this love affair with Ludendorff and the Kaiser, which is hard to fit into that framework. Anyway, let me stop there. Those are good quotes, though.
Mencken is very quotable. I want to just ask if anybody on the panel wants to make a final comment about anything. Ira indicated maybe one little point.
It's a footnote. Read this book. It's rich. It will. If your blood pressure is too low, it may raise it. And
if it's high, you need to take a pill with it.
But it's a thoughtful, feisty intervention into a public conversation about who and what we are. The footnote is when after Franklin Roosevelt took to the Democratic Party the word liberal, Herbert Hoover wrote a long article in the Saturday Evening Post and said, how dare he steal this word liberal? We are the liberals, we Republicans, because we are part of the classical tradition. So we should be careful about language. If I made one more footnote, which has to do with rules of the game and how they shift and how we measure support for different. It turns out that the current Republican Congress was elected with 47% of the American people. But the way in which the last election, because of the way in which Democratic votes are concentrated in cities, they tend to win, not just leave aside the majority-minority district issue, but Jerry Nadler is elected with 82% of the vote.
That's all?
In New York, whereas many in much of America, congressmen are elected, good majority, 55-45. But so you have a state like Pennsylvania where the proportions of the now that's a mirror image of what we used to have in 1942. The Republican Party won a majority of the popular vote, but given the Southern hegemony and rules, the Democrats controlled the legislature. So it's not what's central to the book, but I think we have to be careful about how we connect popular perceptions and preferences to the ideological and political worlds in which we live. And there's an institutional intercession between the two which deeply commands our attention. The very last thing, I promise, I just want to salute something I loved about this book. It is dedicated to somebody who, it turned out, was my freshman dorm advisor in what is now called Carmen Hall, but was then called New Hall, waiting for a donor, right? And Carmen was not a donor, he was a dean. Dedicated to the memory of a wonderful man, Frank Macchiarola, 1941, 2012, Catholic Democrat, Mensch, great Brooklynite, and I endorse every word.
All right. Well, thank you all. Oh, wait, one last word from Judith.
This has gotten too mushy for me. We're all liberals, we're all conservatives, and all of this. I mean, liberalism and democracy, did not always go together like love and marriage.
Of course not.
I mean, no, but there's
neither did conservatism and democracy.
No, well,
goes without saying.
Of course, that goes without saying. But all I mean to say is that things changed radically in this country as a result of the New Deal. The New Deal did make it possible that no one could, in the main, disparage the people the way intellectuals on both the conservative and liberal side did before the New Deal. So we live still in a New Deal world. The other thing, and then you can all go, is that the phenomenon that all of you are talking about is a function of the post-World War II liberal world. When Fred talks about the rise of public sector unions and their importance, whether you like them or not, and Fred doesn't like them, it's a function of deindustrialization and globalization, which was begun in the 80s as a solution to the problems of the movement to the red states. Is not simply middle-class people making a decision. I mean, that is the result of various government policies. But your point is that just as the Democrats couldn't deal with globalization in the 70s, they still don't have a strategy distinct from neoliberalism to deal with people's work. Okay.
Just 6 seconds.
Okay.
Think about upstate New York and the opposition to fracking. People, liberals I talk to upstate, especially in Ithaca, Cornell, are determined to keep people poor and barefoot upstate. Yes. No, this is where we agree.
Yeah, I know.
All right, we are going to stop. Thank you to Fred Siegel. Thank you to the panel. Fred's book is on sale, and he will definitely sign it if you're willing to buy it. So you have to go out there to sign my book. I'd love to. Oh, so I didn't bring my copy.
To ever have anything like this.
All right. I'm sorry you can't get there free dinner. Where are you going? No.
Oh,
You know, there's a very nice new
this is an
It would be a good idea.
of Fred's.
I've heard.
I think it's actually the best.
My name?
It's right next to that.
Yeah,
I
it
think
has
it's
to
the
do
best
with
restaurant in
it's not me,
It's
it's
the
my
French
family,
bistro.
it's my father.
And it's very good. So sometime when you're around.
But I think I've seen you on.
When you come up for
That
which
is possible.
one?
I've
It's
been
actually,
around.
I mean, look, it's not Michelin stars, but you know what the relevance is like in food.
Eric, which one is that?
What's that?
Which one is that? Look at cup.
Flat
That
Top,
sounds
it's
good.
called, 121st and,
Oh, well, you
and
know,
Amsterdam.
that's close,
We're going there for dinner, it's great.
yeah. Serving wine or I am a bad Jew is what I am, because
No.
I didn't even learn any English.
We don't, it's against the rules.
I'm Fred Siporian.
Wonderful talk. Thank you. Hey, Darren, thank you for coming. I didn't even see what you asked your question.
Hey, how you doing?
Nice to see you.
Yes, I'm delighted. Okay, so I have to read your book now.
Yes, please, and you
I'm
got
for
my email,
So
so
that's,
just, you know.
okay, somewhere it's in the email swamp.
Yeah, I'm gonna say goodbye because I'm
That'd
not
be good.
going to Oh, David!
Thank you for coming, thank you. Sure, sure.
It's not Sam, I'm right tomorrow. I just graduated.
Let me give you a
Sure, of course. Oh, I know
I'm at the graduate school. It was between doing a PhD and doing journalism. I read Free Labour and Reconstructionist major book thesis.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you very much for coming. I
have my vote.
Both journalism and academia are under pressure now, but I think it's better off for journalism. So,
Yeah, well,